as well as the impact on the concept and the nature of power as results of the coronavirus pandemic. Great powers are competing today to foresee any shift to guarantee their position on the world power map. This pandemic has forced all to rethink their strategies in dealing with the most simple things and behavior to the most complicated ones, leading us to call it a strategic shock. This pandemic has forced all to rethink their strategies in dealing with the most simple things and behaviors to the most complicated ones, leading us to call it a strategic shock. Therefore, understanding the consequences of this pandemic and providing an explanation for it by using accurate methodological tools would enable us to predict and foresee its potential geostrategic shifts. We, at the Emirates Policy Center, have never stopped brainstorming on any strategic shifts in the region and the world. Today, we shoulder this responsibility equipped with scientific methodological tools to employ the minds of strategic experts and renowned theorists. We are honored to have with us in this symposium the renowned US scholar Joseph Nye, who has developed a precise knowledge of power concept and theorized about soft power and helped in designing strategies to implement it. Moderator of symposium will be Dr. Zaid Ayadat, Professor of Political Science and expert in the game theory, and one of the famous Arab scholars. Dr. Zaid, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abtisam. Thank you. And thanks to EPC, a leading think tank in the region, indeed. Well, your introduction is very humbling, and moderating a discussion with the renowned Joseph Nye is intimidating at the same time. So let me get over my fears by inviting you, dear Joe, to give us an opening statement about your most recent books and your views of this crazy world we live in. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ted. I also find it a pleasure to be able to join the Emirates Policy Center, albeit from the other side of the world in terms of temperature. But let me say a word or two about the title of my most recent book and why it's relevant to this COVID crisis that we're going through. My book is called Do Morals Matter? presidents in foreign policy from FDR to Trump. And it takes on the conventional wisdom that in international politics, it doesn't matter. There's no moral rule at all, which I think is wrong. I remember once when I was working for the US State Department, a meeting with a French diplomat, and I asked him whether he thought about the moral issues that we were dealing with. He said, no, the only thing that I care about is the interests of France. That's the only morality. And I don't think he realized what a profound moral judgment he had made with that statement. People then say, it's all national interests. That's all that matters. But the answer is every leader has to defend the interests of his or her country. The question is, how do they define that interest? You can define it narrowly in transactional terms of just zero sum, or you can define it broadly in ways which include the interests of others. So in my book, for example, I discuss the early presidents after 1945 who invented the Marshall Plan, which presented 2% of American gross domestic product to the European countries for their recovery. Now, that was good for the United States, but it was good for the Europeans. In other words, what Harry Truman, the president at the time, did was define American national interests in such a way that included the interests of the Europeans. Alas, the presidency we see today, President Trump, tends to define American national interests much too narrowly. Each thing is a transaction on its own basis. And that brings us to the COVID crisis and the current situation. I'm disappointed in both the US and in China as great powers, a rising power, and how they've responded to this crisis. Both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, their first reaction was denial, to suppress information, to shift blame. And then they turned to propaganda. It was your fault. It was my fault. There was a Chinese foreign ministry spokesman who said the Americans had introduced it. And President Trump began calling it the China virus. This doesn't get us anywhere. It really is it's a zero-sum approach, and it's an example of what I would call the failure of morality. Instead of that, what we should see is US and China working with others, Europeans, the whole group of 20, to launch a major international fund to help poorer countries deal with the coronavirus. We know from 1918, in which the flu pandemic killed more people than were killed in all of World War I, that viruses like this can come in waves. And what's interesting in 1918 is that more people were killed in the second wave of the influenza epidemic than in the first wave. Alas, we may see 2 or more waves of this coronavirus. We should be working together now to understand more about the disease, to cooperate with this, both individually and through the World Health Organization. But we should also set up a fund to help those countries which don't have adequate medical facilities to have a capacity to deal with the coronavirus. It should be like a Marshall Plan for the poorer countries so that they can cope with this new pandemic. That's why I think the title of my new book, Do Morals Matter, is relevant, which is we could be defining our national interests broadly, so there would be in our interests for our own health, but in the interests of poorer people as well. Unfortunately, we're not doing that. And what we're seeing is China engaging in what's sometimes called face mask diplomacy, trying to cover over the poor record they had at the beginning of this virus, and Americans engaging in propaganda about a Chinese virus. So in that sense, I think we're seeing a failure of moral leadership by both of the powers, China and the US. And I think it'd be a much healthier world if we could get away from that. Well, let me stop there, but that's basically how I would relate the concept of my new book, Do Morals Matter, to the current crisis of the coronavirus.
Well, thank you, Joe. That's a profound and relative. So looking at national interests widely or narrowly will define our morality one way or another. But, you're talking about the moral failure reminds me with your book about democratic deficit as well. So if we have a democratic deficit and we have a moral failure, and if we narrowly define our national interest, I think Mearsheimer has a point then. The great delusion of the entire liberal system at large. So that brings me actually, Joe, to with you trying to decode and to demystify the status quo of the current balance of power and the strategic outlook of the world before start talking about these shocks and shifts of this geostrategic. So what the hell is this a great power competitions all about? We've been living with that since Theseus. So what's new about it? Would you please?
Well, it's normal for great powers to compete. What we have to learn is that we can compete and cooperate at the same time. What somebody like John Mearsheimer, who focuses only on the competition, fails to understand is that there are a number of new issues, which are transnational issues, which know no borders, which no government can solve by itself. The pandemic is an example. The flu virus or the coronavirus doesn't care a bit about the nationality of the human it kills. And we have to realize that on issues like pandemics or like climate change, which is going to affect us all, it's not power over other countries that matters, it's power with other countries. For example, on climate change, 40% of the greenhouse gases, the warming gases, are put into the atmosphere by China, which is the largest emitter now, and the US. That doesn't mean that the US benefits if China puts more in the atmosphere. We're worse off. So we need to be helping and encouraging China to reduce the energy intensity of its economic growth and vice versa. In other words, that's power with others as opposed to power over others. At the same time, we can compete, for example, in the South China Sea, where China has built artificial islands and militarized them. And the United States sends freedom of navigation operations through their naval operations to prove that, as the Hague Tribunal has said, that this is illegal under international law. So we can compete and cooperate simultaneously. And that's the failure, I think, of some of people like John Mearsheimer in their approach of focusing only on great power competition. Donald Trump's national security strategy says that our security strategy is about great power competition. Notice that that security strategy doesn't protect us at all from a virus which has already killed more people than we lost in some of our wars. So it's not enough to say security is just competition. Security nowadays has to be competition and cooperation simultaneously.
Well, again, thank you very much. Again, some people will react to that in different ways. Some will take it as, as for granted argument, explaining what is happening. That should good light and an explanation of the current situations, if you wish, of the outlook of the global strategic balance. Yet, people are seeing the world now after Corona virus spread as being on the branch and on the edge of either or. Either a total shift toward Asia and China will rise as the only winner of the crisis, which means and confirm what Dr. Blissam was saying about these strategic shocks. Either saying, well, you know what, business as usual with very few modification. It seems to me, reading your articles, you may, relate more to the second camp, that business as usual, but rather than a total shift of geostrategic balancing. Would you please elaborate more on this?
Well, I have argued there's a great exaggeration of Chinese power. I mean, China has done very well with its economy. It has raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But if we see, as some people claim, that China was just about to pass the United States in total power, that's simply not the case. If you think of three aspects of power, military power, economic power, and soft power, in military power, China doesn't begin to approach the United States in global power. For example, if you ask, how strong is China in the Persian Gulf? Not. How strong is the United States? The US Navy still matters a lot. Where there has been enormous Chinese growth is in economic growth. China is now, so China is importing its oil from the Middle East, but it has to go through, measured in exchange rates, an economy nearly 2/3 the size of the United States economy. But what we know is that the era of high rates of economic growth are now past. Or another way of putting it is they've picked the low-hanging fruit. And the hard question is whether China is going to be able to move into becoming a high-income country or would be stuck in the so-called middle-income trap. They have some problems to face. Demographically, their labor force has peaked, and their ability to use international export markets to absorb their surplus capacities is no longer going to be there. So we don't know what the future is going to be there, but China's economic power has increased, but it still hasn't passed the US. And when it comes to soft power, the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment, basically public opinion polls show
workers become as productive as Portuguese workers are today, that is around half as productive as Americans, China will see its GDP rise to double that of the United States. So not only he's talking about it's competing, it will double its GDP first, and he refers to it as also very high tech advancements, including artificial intelligence, the 5G, the Huawei, etc., and the money that they've done there. Now, leave alone, of course, that this superiority of American military power that Mattis talked about in 2018, where he says that in operational levels we can send our troops anywhere, do what we want, anytime we want. So what he's saying, that sphere of influence that used to be only American is no longer for the Americans, and not only that, but the Chinese actually is moving up very quickly, and this confirms the shift of balance toward Asia, and China will be leading. What will you tell Graham about this?
Well, Graham is a good friend, but he and I disagree on this. There's no pure Harvard line on anything.
Right.
Basically, I think he tends to always select things which exaggerate China. For example, of the measures you can make of GDP, you can use purchasing power parity, which is an economist's device to measure welfare, and try to prove that China is bigger than the US. That's what he does. But you don't import jet engines or oil at purchasing power parity, you import it at exchange rates. And at exchange rates, the numbers are very clear. China is 2/3 the size of the US. And in per capita income, it's 1/4 the size of the US. So the question is, will China, which basically has an income at the level of the world average for middle income countries, will China be able, about 16,000 in his measure of purchasing power parity, will it be able to reach America 60,000 in the next decade or two? I think unlikely. And I think he doesn't pay enough attention to the fact that the conditions which made China do so well with double-digit growth are no longer there. And there's a recent book edited by David Shumbaugh of George Washington University, which goes over the various difficulties that China is facing and makes the point that you can't project from China's success in the past into seeing this as the wave of the future. So I would come closer to that. And I think it's also interesting to see that if China's doing so well, why isn't the yuan becoming a more important part of world reserve currencies? Ironically, even though this deep crisis is hurting all countries, including the United States, there's a rush to the dollar because the dollar is a sense of security. And why is that? It's because the US has deep and fluid capital markets and a rule of law. There's not some communist bureaucrat who's going to suddenly change the role of the Federal Reserve System. So I think Graham likes to select evidence that reinforces his view, which he's been pushing for some time, the China threat. China's a problem, but it's not something we can't manage.
Well, this is fantastic. Well, look, this is what we do sometimes as political scientists, IR scholars. Sometimes we exaggerate, sometimes we underestimate, and most of the time we stretch our concepts, right? So they fit everything. So one size for all. And some of them, by stretching these concepts and events and exaggerating the possible impact that is no way to be measured accurately, is comparing what is happening with COVID-19 with the Suez moment, when Great Britain has lost its superiority and dominance to the United States. So how that can be compared?
Well, that's a very good example because remember the key question in Suez, where Britain tried to work with France and Israel to reassert its primacy in the Middle East, was brought to heel by the US refusing to send Britain dollars to back up the pound. There was a run on the pound. The IMF had to give Britain a loan, and Britain had to retreat from its expedition into Suez. It noticed that the current Corona crisis is not at all like that. You don't see the Chinese giving a yuan loan to bail out the American dollar or the IMF bailing out the United States dollar. Quite the contrary. As I mentioned, the money in capital is flowing into the dollar, not out of the dollar. So it's just the opposite of what happened to the British and the British pound. I find this a misuse of a historical metaphor.
Okay, if that is a misuse of the historical metaphor, so how about Russia? And now Russia is competing with the States to take over what you call American century. So it's not only the 20th century was American century, but to you, the 21st century will continue to be an American century in terms of American dominance of global politics. Now, Graham and others are seeing that power is not only moving toward China, but Russia reasserting itself in the global competitions over power, especially given their military industry and nuclear weapons and other strategic advantages. I was about to say energy, but I'm not sure anymore if I can say something about oil. But what do you think about that?
Well, Russia has a strangely unbalanced economy. 2/3 of its exports are dependent upon oil and gas, which means that it can be whipsawed up and down. The real secret to success is whether Russia can transform itself into a next generation information-based economy. And we don't see that happening yet. Russia has asserted itself militarily, particularly in the Middle East. You see them in Syria and so forth. But if you ask, I mean, tactically, Putin is successful in that. But if you ask whether he solved the strategic problem of laying the long-term basis for Russian economic growth, no, he hasn't. So as a strategist, he's failed. As a tactician, he's been quite successful. But frankly, I'd rather play the China hand in this game than the Russian hand.
Well, I agree to that. Now, Joe, look, this is very important. APC, Dr. Sam, been doing for the last 6-7 years, trying to deal with this concept and of power and how it's changed and what forms power might take, and trying to employ in the work like the most rigorous methodological approach at hands, including software-based kind of modelings. And thinking of power in terms of hard power and soft power, which you have coined back in 1990, beautifully traveled all over the world. And some people try to add to that smart power. And I was also reading your article on how sharp power can impact soft power. And I'm not sure people know in this region much about the sharp power. So and how that is actually associated with disinformation and misinformation. And then that will take me later on to talk about the power of narratives and the power of stories as part also of the soft power attraction and persuasion. So let's just shed a light on that and see how the soft power, hard power, sharp power, smart power are distributed globally.
Well, let's go back to the beginning and ask what's power? Well, power is the ability to affect others to get what you want. And you can do that 3 ways. You can do it by coercion, you can do it by payment, or you can do it by attraction, getting others to want what you want. And the third of those is what I call soft power. Now, in many ways, in the short run, hard power works more quickly and more efficiently than soft power. But sometimes in the long run, soft power is more effective. For example, in the Cold War, the hard power of the military was essential to deter the Russian takeover or the Soviet takeover of Berlin. But when the Berlin Wall finally came down in 1989, it didn't come down under a barrage of artillery. It came down under hammers and bulldozers, which were wielded by people whose minds had been changed by ideas that had crossed the Iron Curtain. That was soft power. It wasn't artillery, it was hammers wielded by people whose minds had changed. They were attracted to something else. So that's an example of how in the long run, soft power can be quite effective, even though in the short run, hard power is often more effective. One of the interesting questions is, how do you combine hard and soft power so that they don't cancel each other out? Going back again to another Cold War example, after World War II, the Soviet Union had a great deal of soft power in Western Europe, a great deal of attractiveness, because it had stood up against Hitler and fascism. But then after the Soviet Union entered Hungary with force to put down the Hungarian Revolution in '56, its hard power preserved its empire in Eastern Europe, but it destroyed its soft power. No longer did people see it as defending freedom or attractive. So that was a failure to combine hard and soft power, and therefore it was a failure to create smart power. Smart power is when you can combine hard and soft power so they reinforce each other, and otherwise they may undercut each other. Now, sharp power is a concept which was introduced in the last few years by a group in Washington called the National Endowment for Democracy that said the things that the Russians are doing with their propaganda campaigns or with their interference in the American elections, or that the Chinese are doing with their propaganda, are really not designed to attract. They're really designed to interfere and to basically disrupt. And so they said, this is not soft power. This is essentially what they call sharp power. Or another way of putting it, it's old traditional information warfare, which has been around for centuries. And so the three concepts, soft power, smart power, which combines hard and soft, are very different from sharp power, which essentially is using information for as a weapon or information warfare. So all three exist, and all three are being exercised today, but they are separate concepts.
Well, thank you again, Joe. Dr. Bassam, I have so many questions coming in.
May I ask Professor Dr. Zaid a question?
Yeah, I'll give you the floor.
Okay, thank you. Joe, in your book, Do Mores Matter, on the future of the global order, you recommended that focus should not be only placed on the US competition with both China and Russia, but also on illicit drug trafficking and pandemics. So why don't decision makers listen to these warning and recommendation?
Well, it's a great question, and I wish they would. But I think the answer is because they're the prisoners of old-fashioned thinking. When you look at some of these new problems, what I call transnational problems that cross borders outside the control of governments, this takes a new way of thinking. And it's much easier for politicians and leaders to use the old ways of thinking. So you wind up with somebody like Donald Trump, who comes into office and who withdraws the United States from the Paris Climate Accords. That's very much old-fashioned thinking. And he has a base. It's not the majority of people in the US, but he has a solid base of narrowly populist nationalist support, which wanted him to do that. And so he did. Alas, you don't find many leaders who are thinking ahead on these issues. You find more of it to some extent in Europe. Somebody like French President Macron or German Chancellor Merkel are thinking ahead on these issues and placing a greater priority on them. But alas, right now, the Americans are locked into the old-fashioned thinking. I would argue certainly Russia is locked into old-fashioned thinking, and so is China, I'm afraid. So it's going to take a while. I hope if we see a change in the American presidency after the November election, the next administration may be paying more attention to these new issues.
Hope so. Have another question. The US had dealt with the coronavirus in an isolationist manner, but not as a global leader. Even with its allies, such as the Gulf countries, how will this be reflected on its role in the world order?
Well, I fear that that Trump is using this to turn inward more than we should. He's now trying to restrict immigration when immigration has been one of the great strengths of the United States. He's also trying to restrict more on trade. I feel that that the U.S. in the last several years has taken a number of approaches which define our national interests very narrowly. And I think that undercuts our soft power as well as our long run interest. The good news, however, is that when you look at the public opinion polls, such as those taken by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which polls the American public every 2 years, 70% of the American people responded in the last poll that they wanted a more outward-looking foreign policy. So I think Trump may represent the voice of the past rather than the voice of the future.
Dr. Zaid.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Sam. Thank you. Joe, I hope we're not tiring you. You can have some water or something while I'm looking some questions. All right. So there are a lot of questions coming. I'll be collecting most of them and raise them in one way or another. But now I have a question on a very dear topic, that is globalization. And this COVID has altered the entire notion of globalization and is bringing back to the isolationist kind of policy and, all the protective economic policies we've seen in history. In your article, you argue differently. Although people have less trust in all these global transaction and interaction, leave alone institutions that are governing our globalized world. So what do you think of this?
Well, I think we're going to see, I think globalization, economic globalization peaked before the COVID crisis. You already had efforts by the United States to curtail the economic integration with China. You also had broader responses in other parts of the world worrying about China's exploitation of the World Trade Organization, treating it as not a level playing field, but giving subsidies to state-owned enterprises and coercive intellectual property transfer. This had already led to many European countries, Australia, others, to cutting back on some of their economic integration with China. So I think you're seeing some setback for economic integration as a result of the so-called trade wars. Former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd wrote a very interesting article about 6 months ago showing that some areas of economic integration were cutting back, but others weren't, such as financial integration had not. But whatever happens with economic integration, notice that doesn't stop what I call ecological interdependence. So if globalization is interdependence at intercontinental scale, something like climate change is not stopped by these political decisions. Tariffs and walls may stop the import of products. They don't stop the transfer of greenhouse gases across the atmosphere, which affects everybody. They don't stop the flow of viruses across borders, which can't be controlled by tariffs or by walls. So ecological globalization obeys the laws of physics and biology, not the laws of politics. So I think what we're seeing, if you want, is we're cutting back on some of the more beneficial aspects of globalization, but we're not cutting back on some of the more detrimental aspects of globalization. And that means that the idea that we can somehow retreat behind borders to protect ourselves just doesn't make any sense. So I don't think globalization is dead. I think it has received a setback, and I think we're going to see less of economic globalization, but we're not going to see less of the ecological globalization.
Thank you, Joe, again. Now, I have a question from Ahmed from Jordan, I think, and from Fawaz Tanon. Fawaz is asking about how will Corona affect the global system? And I think you've been trying to answer that in different ways, maybe just direct to this. And Ahmed is asking about the future role for the United Arab Emirates in the regional power configuration.
Well, I think
so these are the two questions.
I think that the coronavirus is going to have an effect. We're going to see a global recession, or unlike anything we've seen since the 1930s, and that is going to be a setback for the economy. For countries like the Emirates, it's going to have a very powerful effect. We're already beginning to see it on oil and gas as primary exports. And in terms of the issue I mentioned earlier, there are going to be many poor countries, some of them who are neighbors of the Emirates, which are not capable of dealing with, they don't have the public health systems to deal with the coronavirus. And if there's another wave of the coronavirus, which I think there probably will be, this will overflow into the Emirates, as well as into Europe, as well as into the United States. So if we were optimistic, we would hope that the Emirates and others would take a lead in terms of organizing a regional fund or technical assistance to try to help with countries that are not that far away, like Ethiopia or Eritrea or East Africa and so forth, or South Sudan, because if the virus recovers or has a reservoir there, it won't stay there. It's going to overflow. So I would think there is a role for countries like the Emirates to organize regional activities, funds, and so forth to try to cope with this. It's going to be a bad economy, and that's going to make a lot of governments say, well, let's cut back. We don't want to spend. But going back to my example earlier about do morals matter, if you define your national interest broadly, and you realize that a second wave of the virus, which originates in some of these poor countries, will kill you as well as the people locally, then a broad definition of the national interest is to say, let's establish a regional fund and do something about it.
Fantastic. Well, I have another question from Ahmed Islam Ishaqat, I think. So basically he's saying, would it be possible to go with Mearsheimer and Cohen that the United States should bring Russia to its camp in its efforts to contain China?
Well, it's a good.
That's bizarre.
No, but it's a good question because basic balance of power 101, so to speak, would say that driving Russia and China into each other's arms is a big mistake. After all, in the Cold War, Russia and China were first allied, but after Nixon's visit to China and the split of China and Russia, that China and Soviet Union as it then was, that greatly undercut the Soviet threat. So the reverse of that would be if you have a triangle of large powers, it's 2-to-1, the Russia and Chinese can be the 2 as against the American 1. So there's some elementary logic and good sense in Mearsheimer's view, which is you don't want to balance of power grounds. You don't want to push Russia and China together. On the other hand, notice that there are still some differences between Russia and China. While they have reconciled many of their differences of interest, China still has a lot of extra people. Russia has a lot of extra empty land in Siberia, and there's a remaining suspicion among many Russians about too many Chinese people occupying that empty land. In addition, there's a competition between Russia and China for influence in Central Asia, areas like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so forth. So the idea that this is going to be a reassertion of the Sino-Soviet bloc of the 1950s is very unlikely. But at the same time, the Americans ought to be more cognizant of the importance of not driving the Russians and Chinese too closely together. So it's a sensible and important question.
Thank you.
Zaid, if you allow me, there is a question from Ayman Al-Izza. He's saying, asking, what is your predictions, Professor, going forward? How do you see the pandemic affecting the US elections and the geopolitics in general?
Well, on the US election, I think the coronavirus has greatly weakened Donald Trump's prospects of re-election. If you'd asked me at the beginning of 2020, would Trump be re-elected, I would have said the probabilities were above 50%. Today, I'd say the probabilities are below 50% because he's badly mishandled it. He was slow in responding. He hasn't organized well. He gives different explanations all the time. If you look at in America, there's generally a pattern of what's called rally around the president. When there's a crisis, the American people tend to rally around the president. George W. Bush saw this after 9/11, where his popularity had been relatively low before 9/11. After the attack on the World Trade Center towers, all of a sudden Bush's popularity shot up. Trump's popularity went up to about 60% in terms of how well he was handling the crisis in the early days of the crisis, but now they're back down below 50%. And his personal popularity has always stayed about range of 46%. So I think Trump's been weakened by the pandemic because of the inept and fumbling way in which he's managed it. As for geopolitics more generally, the people who see a big change in geopolitics assume that China is going to come out of this doing very well, the US doing very badly. What I've argued is that both China and the US are doing badly, and the Chinese rate of economic growth, which officially was 6% before the crisis, is now more like minus 6%. But even before the crisis, the real rate of economic growth, as opposed to the politically proclaimed rate of economic growth, was probably closer to 2 or 3%. So China went into this crisis with already a slowdown of economic growth. And I think in that sense, the argument that the pandemic is going to transform the trend lines of Chinese and American power, I don't think so. I think the inept handling is going to hurt both countries in terms of their reputations, but on these underlying aspects of economic and military power, I don't think it's going to transform that.
Okay. So, Joe, let me take you back to the foundations of this. So, American grand strategy after World War II was to build and sustain and protect the liberal system, the liberal order, which ended up in what was called the liberal hegemony, based on certain rules and on certain institutional arrangements that deliver to peace, security, and also economic prosperity. So many other countries used and misused the system to their advantage, including China, of course, and they played by rules to their own interest. One can't but wonder, what would an American grand strategy look like in this new great power competitions, given the newness of the entire age that is ruled one way or another by these technological advancements that are reshaping our human existence? So I just can't but wonder, what would you envision an American grand strategy in this new age?
Well, I think imagine that you have a new government in next year, what they might want for a strategy. If Trump is reelected, I think you're going to see more of what you got. I don't think Trump's going to change very much. But I do think that you're seeing, or you could see, a broader strategy if you have a change of administration. What would they or should they focus on? Well, first of all, you have to maintain the alliance system. To start with, in my book, Do Morals Matter, I say, always start with realism. The problem with too many realists is they stop where they start. So start with realism, and realism says, what's the balance of power? What needs to be done? So you've got to think of the fact that Russia is a threat to its neighbors. If you're living in Poland or in Estonia, you notice that Russia is a threat. And if you live in Ukraine, you're particularly aware of it. So maintaining NATO, strengthening NATO, and the European alliance is part one. China is seen as a threat to its neighbors in East Asia. One of the things that is interesting is China has 14 boundaries with other countries, and it has territorial disputes with many of them. Japan, India, Vietnam. China has claims for their territory, and these countries worry about that. They don't want to be dependent on China, and therefore they welcome an American presence. So maintaining the US-Japan Security Treaty, where Japan pays 2/3 of the costs of the American troops being there, is the equivalent in East Asia to NATO on the European theater. So maintaining the alliances, strengthening them, is part one of the strategy. But part two of the strategy has got to be dealing with these new transnational issues, things like a pandemic. This is not the last pandemic we're going to see. We should be strengthening the World Health Organization. We should be setting up new funds. We should be setting up new forms of cooperation on international health networks. Global health is in our long-term self-interest. This is a case where a Marshall Plan makes sense. So doing something about climate change, about pandemics, about the whole range of transnational issues is part two. And part three is to develop institutional frameworks. The UN system has its problems, but on the other hand, it's still vital. It's the only thing we have. And we're going to find that a lot of areas are going to be supported by network organizations, where you get informal networks of officials who try to keep things running smoothly. And the fourth part of the strategy would be repairs at home. The US should be paying much more attention to improving our own healthcare system, to improving our own infrastructure, to maintaining the high rate of investment in R&D and the new technologies that are necessary. So those would be the four components of a grand strategy for a new administration. Frankly, if President Trump is reelected, I don't think you're going to see any of them.
Sorry to hear that, Joe, but probably will be the case. Dr. Sam, for how long are we staying? Till 6 or 7 or more? So 1 hour, 1 hour and a half. You're muted.
Sorry. We have 2 minutes, Dr. Zaid.
All right. So if I have 2 minutes, I can't but raise these questions. Sorry for all participants. And it has to do with your latest book.
The way we have got 54 questions.
Yes. So your book about the do moral matters. So I want to go back to this combined with the soft power scheme and envision the world as competing narratives, competing perceptions and perspectives. On one hand, you have three powers playing against each other: democracies, authoritarianisms, and populisms. And then you have liberalisms, realisms, and nationalisms. How you will navigate through this, even with morals or without it?
Well, as I said, I think you start with realism. You realize that the world is a difficult place, but you don't stop there. You realize that we also have an interest in a institutional structure of multilateralism, which allows others to play in the game as well. We also have an interest in making sure that we don't leave the rest of the world behind in terms of poverty and disease. Then that's in our long run self-interest. So I think realism plus a touch of liberalism plus a touch of cosmopolitanism can give us a better world than the one in which we're sliding into now, which is marked very much by nationalistic populism and inward orientation. So I think there's a chance for that turn in the right direction. But as I say, I don't see it happening yet.
Fantastic. Last question, Doctor. It's important. So this is from Bashar Abu Khair. He's saying the EU, because we have no question about EU, may have survived Brexit, the refugee crisis, and the financial meltdown of 2008. Do you think they would survive this COVID?
I think they will survive. I do think, though, that the northern states of Germany and Netherlands, for example, have to become more generous in helping the southern tier of Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain, if they're going to survive. And this is very much a heated debate in Europe right now. But I hope they survive, because I think we all benefit from a stronger EU.
Well, Joe, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so very much. I very much enjoyed, I've learned, and I hope to have more of this and to personally welcome you to both Emirates Palace in the EPC coming ADSD and also at the CSS Center for Strategic Studies in the University of Jordan. I'll take it back to Dr. Abtisam.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for Dr. Absalam for putting this together. It's a pleasure for me to have this chance to chat, and we'll look forward to being able to do it in reality rather than just virtual some point in the future. So thank you very much.
Professor Joe, Professor Zaid, thank you very much. That was wonderful discussion. And I wish we can stay longer, but I think me and the audience, of course, we benefited from the great thoughts we have heard today. Thank you very much. And of course, I'm looking forward to see you after, of course, this pandemic. Stay safe, both of you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.